years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile, later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later. In the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence. The next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later. 80,000 impressions later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. Next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. Several days later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile, One little boost to the surface later. A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later. Later. 1 billion, zillion, jillion, billion, quadrillion times later. Previously.
Earlier that day, 4 hours later, 0 months later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 4,000 years later, 7 minutes later. Meanwhile, on fever, 7,000 months later, load of fireworks later, 666 tweets later, 3 octillion years later, 78,000 worlds later, 82 minutes later, later that night, 40,064 later, 7 trillion yards later, 5 minutes later, 25 seconds later, 2 seconds later, 1 big cube later, 1 minute later, 100 lemons later, 1 day later, 1 hour later, 256 hours later, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 week later, 3 minutes to making this video later, 1 month goes by, 10,000 punishments later, 9 hours later, 4 to 6 days later, 8,292 hours later, 9 billion races later, 8 quadrillion years later, 5,000 SpongeBobs later, 1 restart later, 30 minutes later, a reboot later, another reboot later, 120 minutes later, Meanwhile, in the alternate dimension, several years later, 55 minutes later, 800 graves later, 900 zombies later, 10 minutes later, 666 miles later, 810 hours later, 1 minute of restarting, another restart later, a few moments later, 5 minutes later, a few hours later, 3 days later, 4 hours later, 9,100 comments later, 2016 birthdays later, the 300 episode of Downfall Paradise later.
2 hours later.
Previously on Double Go.
3 hours later.
Later that night. Z next evening. 1 operation later. 2 hours weekend later. 7 who 1 Manuel go later. Later in the Viad. The next day. 1 Viv just is us internet of second Mundo real later. 8,800 years later. Meanwhile, 1,000 hours later. 2 hours second later. 982 hours later.